seems to me we have to. I think we have to start. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats because we should start our session to respect the overall schedule. We are a little bit already late, so if you can take your seats, it would be highly appreciated. Okay. So my name is Thomas Gomart, and I'm the director of IFRI, French Institute for International Affairs. And I was asked by ISP team to chair this very interesting panel we have this afternoon to start our discussion. The title of the panel is as broad as difficult, I would say, beyond the crisis towards a new regional balance. So to discuss this hot topic, we have 4 distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them very briefly. We have Mr. Ahmed ABOUL, who is the Secretary General of the Arab League. Welcome. We have Mr. Ibrahim AL-JAAFARI, who is the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Iraq. Welcome. We have Mr. Yousef bin Ahmed AL-OTHAIMEEN, who is the Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. Welcome. And we have also Roberta, MALLEY, who is the Vice President for ICG, International Crisis Group. So let me start with an understatement, which is to say that the MENA region, which is not so easy to define, is in need of a security network, a security framework. It is for sure an understatement if you observe the tragic humanitarian situation in many countries of the region, if you observe the recent events which occurred in this region. I will list a few of them, among others, in this order, just to illustrate the complexity of the situation we are facing. Obviously, the war in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, the crisis within the GCC, the Trump administration decision regarding the JCPOA with Iran, the difficult situation in countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, the question of consistent terrorist attacks everywhere, and very recently in Egypt, for instance, the referendum in Kurdistan, the question of refugees, the question of internal displacement within this region, and to finish with all the external influences on this region. So the good news is for sure that Daesh has been defeated in Mosul and in Mosul and Raqqa, which also opens a discussion with the consequences for its relationship with Al-Qaeda. But the situation is as if we have nothing to really celebrate. There is this victory, but what does this victory mean in political terms for the next few months? The ideology of Daesh remains in this region, and as I said with my slip of the tongue, obviously the interplay between Daesh and Al-Qaeda is very critical. So for this first round of discussion, each of the panelists will have approximately 8 minutes. And I would like to ask them a very simplistic question, but certainly their point of view would differ on it. According to you, where is the center of gravity of the region?
Where is the
Center of gravity, centre de gravité of the region. I don't know how to say in Arabic, sorry. I think that the differences in responding will be interesting to be noted. So, sir, could we start with your point of view on that?
Thank you very much. If I may speak in Arabic, because the panel is mostly Arabs, so allow me please to speak in Arabic. عندما اطلعت على عنوان هذا
When I've seen the title of this panel, Beyond the Crisis Towards a New Regional Balance, I felt that this title is overly optimistic because we're not yet there, really. The truth of the matter is that we find in a situation where we are about to defeat Daesh in Iraq and in Syria. This is a fact that we can all see for ourselves. But this does not mean that Daesh is going to vanish, to disappear tomorrow or in 10 years. It will remain in the form of small cells. The fact that it has been defeated, well, it has been defeated as a military force on the ground, but it's likely to go back to cities and to destroy, to create destruction and terror. Well, the climate created by Daesh is still there and will be with us unless we change the conditions and the situation. And if we do manage to change the situation, we will not have this reality for decades. Now, the other point has to do with the regional forces. The intervention of regional forces was responsible for many of the facts which have occurred. And this will remain as it is unless there is a change in the balance of forces. And we feel that at regional level, we can see sort of something like a word conflict looming. It's as if we were reverting to the Cold War years. I see that for a number of problems, we can't think of an immediate solution. There is a will to find a solution in Libya, but the conditions in Libya are very complex, and we need to make major efforts to find a solution. The situation in Yemen could be defined in the following manner. The Arab countries, or the so-called Arab security system, still sort of featured by these agreements between the various Arab states. Some are afraid of Iran's influence. Others in North Africa find that there is a more serious threat, which is a threat coming from South Africa, and we have to take into consideration the Gulf area as well. So there is no unity as such. There's not a common perspective in terms of priorities for the security of Arab countries. How do we view the situation? You spoke about the last 2 months, but let's go back a year and a half or 2 years in time. Let's hope that in 1 year and a half, Iraq will put an end to the situations which led to considerable damage in the last few years. However, the Iraq as a country, as a state, will have to strike a balance within the country between the Sunni, the Shia, the Kurds, and the Arabs, because Iraq has several religious confessions. The good news is that the state of Iraq has gained more ground in the northern part of the country. But we also have to try and solve the problem of the Kurdish part of the population. I believe that in a year and a half, there won't be sort of a central government. That we will try to gain control on the whole of the Syrian territory and within the Syrian borders. The unity, the territorial unity of Syria is a crucial element for the Arab League. There will be rivalry between the Russians and the U.S. For the decades to come, and there will be other powers that will come into the picture, such as China. So how do we view the solution in terms of a new balance to be achieved in the region? I think we have to add some common approach. There should be some form of agreement between the Arabs in terms of security. If we can define a number of priorities which we all agree on, if we agree on the Palestinian, the Israeli question, the question of Iran, or the question concerning nuclear weapons, well, that would be a first step for the whole process that we could engage in. But there are other issues that concern the security of Arab countries. The whole of the Arab region centers on this issue of security. So first of all, we have this basic notion of security, and then there are more other sort of issues that are connected to the main issue of security. So, and we could sort of include Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, and other countries that we can refer to later on. I think what it's important for us is for Iran to somehow slow down the pace of his work in the region, because we've always had good relations with Iran. If Iran changes its approach, Arabs will be ready to enter into a dialogue with Iran, and it will be a fruitful dialogue that might result into mutual understanding and a common strategic vision for the region. I'm not just referring to the Gulf region, but I'm referring to the region, the Gulf region and the East. It's extremely important that we try and achieve peace in Palestine. How can we achieve that? How can we make peace in Palestine in the framework of a new regional balance? If we want to defeat terrorism, terrorism is the most serious threat for our region. So we have to sort of change our approaches. So we have to keep an open mind when we talk about the different religions. We must try and ensure that we support the development of the economy. We must support the social processes in our countries. We must strengthen democracy and pursue this process in a reasonable span of time.
That's almost perfect.
Very nice.
Thank you very much for your initial remarks, which are very substantive. Let me turn to Mr. Al-JAAFARI, who has now the floor.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullah.
In the name of Allah, may peace be with you. we saw the joy issuing from the defeat of Daesh, with the contribution of the army, the police, the mobilization of the local populations. The Iraqi forces acted as a result of political unity. This is very important for us. It started in September 2014, and there have been several stages. We also enjoyed international support because the international coalition was close to Iraq in this struggle. Iraqi cities have been freed, except for some areas because Daesh tends to move in the dark. It's just a few persons, but they do not represent a strategic threat for the Iraqi regime. We are very happy about this victory, but we cannot be indifferent to the destiny of countries which are still under the rule of Daesh. And therefore, we should unite to fight Daesh. This victory is the result of many sacrifices, of huge efforts by the Iraqi forces during the military stage of the conflict. Also, from the intellectual point of view, there were great changes from the cultural point of view, I'd say. So all Iraqis, regardless of their confession, of their religion, of their ethnic origin, they were together. They all took part: Arabs, Kurds, Sunnis, Muslims, non-Muslims, Shias. Everybody fought. It was a let's say, a unity, which is very important from the human aspect. Some Iraqi provinces have suffered a great deal: Mosul, Anbar, Salahuddin. Other provinces were not passive. They also participated, even if they had not suffered as much as others: Kirkuk, Hok, Basra, Amara, Nasiriyah, Simawa, Karbala, Hilla, Najaf. All these provinces took a very determined position. They took part in the effort of the other provinces to get rid of Daesh. All the countries of the world have seen the Iraqis acting together, united. And this is very important because it earned them the support of the international community, a support which was badly needed. We needed air coverage, especially in early 2014, when Daesh used trucks to move explosives. So we needed airplanes to cover us. The international community pledged on this front. It was the Iraqis who acted militarily on the ground against Daesh, but the international community helped us a great deal under other respects. It's good that the international community stays close to Iraq. Defeating Daesh is not enough. We cannot say that we've solved all the problems by defeating Daesh. After a war, cooperation is badly needed. A lot of destruction requires reconstruction of not only of buildings, but also of societies. Mosul is not at all what it was like before the war. It was a beautiful, wealthy town. It had its own universities. Now it's just ruins, and the same applies to other towns. That's why we need to work together for reconstruction. And I'm asking the international community to help us as it did when we fought against Daesh. I'm asking the international community to be beside us and to support us, undertaking something like the Marshall Plan after World War II. Germany was helped. German cities such as Nuremberg have been rebuilt. And Germany has been able to have a rebirth to enjoy economic and cultural growth again. And this was very helpful to end any tension in the area. Daesh tries to focus on areas where tension already exists. We don't need any more problems in the Middle East, especially having neighboring countries in mind. We should try and release tension. Our foreign policy is based on the concept of staying close to all the countries which are suffering because of Daesh and to stay away from any tension areas. We're trying to consolidate brotherhood between peoples. Therefore, keep away from conflict areas or areas where there is some kind of tension or strain, because we do not want to help Daesh promote its culture. What is the ideology Daesh was born from? It's necessary to define that ideology before being able to go forward. We have to know that in order to make our victory and our solutions long-lasting. On what was Daesh based? Terrorism and fear. That's Daesh's strategy. This group demeaned the Muslim religion. The young should be helped in that many of them might decide to join Daesh, and we don't want that to happen.
Thank you, Minister, for your very disciplined and impressed. So I turn now to you, Secretary General. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Please allow me to speak in Arabic, as we agreed in the panel to speak in Arabic language. الحقيقة أنني سعدت كثيرا.
I'm very pleased to participate in this forum for the first time. I'm very pleased to be part of this dialogue for the first time, a dialogue which is being attended by heads of states, foreign ministers, ambassadors, and intellectuals. And I believe this is a unique opportunity for us all to share our thinking, our political views, both in terms of what the position is of politicians and intellectuals. It's very important that we deal with the problems affecting our region in a realistic manner and in a comprehensive manner. There is something else which I've been very happy to hear on this occasion. I've heard the Italian foreign minister, the president of the Lebanese Republic, words which have been very important to sort of design a roadmap forward. with respect to the possible way forward. Well, it's true that the Med dialogue is sort of generally speaking of what needs to be done after the crisis. But as my colleague pointed out, we're still into a period of crisis. We haven't gone beyond the crisis. And we do strongly hope that we will together celebrate the end of the crisis, and then we can prepare what needs to be undertaken after the crisis, at the end of the crisis. But our intellectual and political unity will enable us to think about what needs to be done in the world after the crisis. The Italian foreign minister has said something which was crucial in his speech, and I was very happy to hear him say that. He spoke about the Mediterranean, and he said there are two shores, the northern shore and the southern shore of the Mediterranean. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, we represent mostly the countries on the southern shore of the Mediterranean, which was defined as a small lake. So we indeed are faced with a number of political and economic issues in this part of the Mediterranean. We are confronted with a number of problems, and we have come to the conclusion that we first have to sort out a number of problems to achieve a stage which could be the stage after the crisis. Now, the Palestinian issue, if you take this, for instance, well, for over 50 years, the Palestinian question has been the source of tensions in the Middle East. So if we want to settle this question in conformity with the international law, international legitimacy, and in conformity with UN resolutions and the EU resolutions, we have to move forward and come to a final settlement of the issue. How can we say that the southern shore of the Mediterranean is no longer having problems in terms of unrest, and whilst we are still struggling with this problem? And what about terrorism, be it Al-Qaeda or Daesh, which has attacked hit a number of countries in the northern shore, on the northern shores of the Mediterranean? We have seen how Al-Qaeda has further grown, which has given rise in turn to ISIS, to Daesh. Daesh has gained control of large areas of Syria and Iraq. And I congratulate my colleague, the foreign minister of Iraq, for their defeat, as they have defeated Daesh, and this is going to happen in Syria as well. But it's important to stress that terrorism cannot be addressed only militarily or in terms of security. There are a number of other issues that must be solved to defeat terrorism and extremism, alongside with military means and security provisions. So there are other questions that we should focus on. Well, we have to focus on the media, on a specific way of thinking. You are aware of the fact that Daesh was very capable of using the internet for its own propaganda, and also to ensure that they would raise money. We have this flow of money which crosses continents and knows no border. In addition to that, there's a political question we have to address. If we talk about terrorism, we should be aware of what is the breeding ground for terrorism. Daesh exploits poverty, weaknesses to attract some followers. Well, terror organizations have not grown overnight. They developed in circles that showed empathy with them. So we have to make sure that they no longer have this type of support on the part of the media and intellectuals, so that we can address terrorism with a holistic approach in terms of security, in terms of media, in terms of ideology, and also in terms of funding terrorism. So we would deprive terrorism of its resources, financial resources, when we talk about problems pertaining to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. People say that these are religious problems, but that is not true. These are political problems. When we say that we want to settle the conflicts between countries as if they were religious conflicts, so when we say that the conflicts are religious, we can't solve them. If we say that they are political conflicts, we can think in terms of a solution to the conflicts. Well, in the Middle East, as you know, there are Shia, Sunni, and Christians who have been living together for hundreds of years. The people that their marriages, mixed marriages. So what happened in this time? What has been sort of the reason behind the conflicts that have arisen in the area? When we look at terrorism in the southern part of the Mediterranean, we see that the same terrorism has hit the northern shores of the Mediterranean. We've seen illegal immigration, we've seen movements of migrants that left from countries which are not in the Mediterranean. That means that they were forced, driven to do that because of a number of problems. So they were forced to leave their countries. And we have to try and solve these problems. We have to make investment in those countries. We have to think in terms of a Marshall Plan to help such countries and to do away with the root causes that lead to migration from south to north.
It's now time to turn on my left and to give the floor to Roberta MALLEY.
And allow me to speak in English if I can. Thomas, you started with a...
Because you cannot speak in Arabic.
Maybe. Thomas, you started with a question saying, is there a center of gravity now in the MENA region? And I'm tempted to answer that there's a lot of gravity because we have a grave situation, but there's very little center because the region is so fluid and fragmented and lacking any coherent security system. But I'll come back to that. What I want to do is just give 5 brief points to describe how I see the situation in the region today. The first is that we are living the end of the most acute phase of the fight against Daesh. I think all 3 preceding speakers said that. The phase of the caliphate or the quasi-caliphate or the so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq is now more in the rear-view mirror, which is obviously a good thing, despite we still see that Daesh is able to take very aggressive and violent action. The flip side of the good news is that it means that all of the other underlying conflicts that had been racking the region for many years and which people had more or less put to the side, not entirely, but to some extent, they're coming back to the surface. And that's the list of issues that you raised between Turks and Kurds within Iraq, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, all those issues which had always been there, but people had kind of put to the side to some extent to focus on the fight against Daesh, they're coming back to the surface. And that's why we're dealing with a situation that is not much better than the one we've lived through for the last few years. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that the region is paradoxically as divided and polarized as ever, but it's also as integrated and connected as ever. And that's a pretty explosive situation. Let me explain what I mean. The division and the polarization, I think, is pretty straightforward. You have this, to be very simplistic, division between the camp that is closer to Iran and the camp that's closer to Saudi Arabia and the US. And that division is obviously one that is marking and bloodying the region. But at the same time, when I say that it's more integrated and connected than ever, what I mean by that is that a conflict in one place won't stay in that place, precisely because of this what my friend called this Cold War, so that if something happens in Yemen, it immediately has an impact in Saudi Arabia and Iran, has an impact in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and so forth. So the ability to contain a conflict is much diminished when things are viewed at this holistic level as one fight between two camps. So you have polarization, but you also have interconnectedness. The third point, which is related to this, is that you have a series of potential flashpoints, of potential triggers of conflict. And we could go through the list, whether it's a possible another Houthi missile attack on Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or Dubai, and what that would provoke in terms of possible retaliation on Iranian soil, something that American officials are thinking of. You have the possibility of an incident in the Gulf, a naval incident as occurred 2 years ago, but this time with much graver repercussions between Iran and the United States. You have Iran and the United States that are close by in Iraq, fighting more or less side by side, but meaning that proximity could also translate into hostility. Likewise in Syria, where anything could happen between forces that are closer to the US, forces that are closer to Iran. You have Israel that worries because it sees growing Iranian and Hezbollah presence in southern Syria, but also sees Hezbollah acquiring greater missile capacity and is tempted every now and then to take a preemptive strike. You have the crisis of around the nuclear deal, which could itself lead to consequences if, in fact, the United States decides to walk away from the crisis. How would Iran respond? Now, I would say that none of these crises has a high probability of exploding. But if either one of them does explode, then because of the point I made earlier, it won't be contained. It will spill over into other areas. And so for calm to prevail, for relative peace to prevail, everything has to go right. All of these conflicts have to be contained. But for something to go wrong, all it takes is for one of these incidents to explode. And as we know, we came very close to one just a few weeks ago with a Houthi missile strike aimed at Riyadh. So that's the next point. My fourth point is that at a time where you have so many sources of tension, so many fuses, so many humanitarian catastrophes, you have so little diplomacy. Because Iran and Saudi Arabia are not talking to one another, because the United States and Iran, who had reestablished a high-level political diplomatic dialogue, that has been put to an end. And because you have a new profile, a new administration in the United States that seems to believe less in engagement with its opponents and more in empowering its allies to confront them. So high risk of conflict, low probability, low potential for diplomacy. My last point, my last trait that I think describes this region is that we have what is holding things together if it's not diplomacy. If the reason why things have not exploded is not diplomacy, what it is just a balance of fear. That none of the parties truly wants to confront the other and bring it to the absolute brink because it is afraid of what that would unleash. But the problem with that, the danger that poses, that each party is convinced that the other party also is afraid of confrontation, which gives them the ability to think that they can go just a little bit further. So to take a good example between Hezbollah and Israel, there's what each side calls a balance of fear or balance of terror. Neither side really wants to provoke a confrontation. But neither side could afford to appear to be deterred by the other, and so it pushes the envelope just enough to convince the other side that it's not afraid. But there's always a risk of miscalculation. There's always the risk that one side can't measure exactly what the other side is prepared to endure. So where does that leave us? And I know you wanted to talk about prescriptions in the next session, but just to say, when we have a situation like this of so much uncertainty, so much chaos, so much fragmentation, and the possibility of conflicts starting in one place and quickly burning up the whole region, what is needed is precisely what's lacking, which is dialogue, which is diplomacy, which is what the organization that on whose behalf I'm here today, the International Crisis Group, is advocating. And I think what is quite unique is we have on this panel and in this room the answers to the problems that I just raised. You have a country like Iraq that is able, because of its very unique situation, because of the coexistence that the minister was talking about, to talk to the United States and to talk to Iran and to try to see whether there's a possibility indirectly of lessening tensions there. You have the Arab League and the Organization of the Islamic Conference, both of whom have within their midst countries that are on both sides of that divide. And of course you have in this room Europeans, and I welcome what the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs said today about the necessity of insisting on dialogue, on mediation, and diplomacy. And as I say, we have in the room representatives of people who could live by the principles that, and we had the Lebanese president talk about it, the principles that Lebanon has abided by, which is no winner, no loser, coexistence, and trying to immunize the region from the broader regional, immunize the country from the broader regional and international conflicts. The outcome in Lebanon is not perfect. I think we all know that. And an outcome in the region that would be based on a balance of interests, on coexistence, on finding a solution of no winner, no loser, no exclusion, it's not ideal. But I think we know from experience that it certainly beats the alternative. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert. We have 15 minutes for discussion, so I would suggest I will ask you some personal questions, and please feel free also to interact if needed. I will follow up on what you have said about the needs, the low potential for diplomacy, but to some extent that's the only tool we have in hands at the time being. And I would like to ask you, Secretary General, precisely for the Arab League, what sort of diplomatic role could we expect at the time being? What could be done on the field by the Arab League in this very difficult context?
The problem we are facing within the Arab League is that collectively there is a position, yes, but that position is not necessarily embraced by all. That is one aspect of our problem. You spoke about centers or center of gravity. I fear that you think today it is Iran or Saudi Arabia. It is not so. The center of gravity is centers of gravity, meaning you have a number of states within the region that each from its own perspective influences the developments and the behavior of others. Diplomacy is needed, yes, but the problem is that you have parties, mainly regional, that are interfering, positioning themselves inside Arab territory, using militias, and mind you, through the militias, the nation state is threatened. And the nation state, I think, and I adhere to, is the crux and the core of everything for the future of the Arab region and the Arab security region. You cannot use militias to create or to understand or to establish security arrangements. What I say is, let's have our priorities well set. Focus on a settlement for the Palestinian question. This is the core of everything bad in the region, the Palestinian question. Put a major global proposition for an end game, ending the confrontation between the Palestinians and the Arab on one side and the Israelis, but it has to be fair and just. Also, try to confront the militias. Try to confront those who are inciting the militias. And please, if you do not understand, do not interfere. Why am I saying so? Because there has been so many interference in a place like Libya, for instance, and the result, we see it today, or Syria, and the result, we see it today. So these are issues that, or at least recipes for a better situation.
Thank you very much. I would like to continue this question about diplomacy by asking you, Secretary General, what does it mean, according to you, religious diplomacy in this context? You are representing an organization, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. What can be done through this organization to try to improve the situation on the field?
Well, I think Secretary General broke the covenant that he should speak in Arabic, so now I will speak.
I'm sorry. I was taken by the question.
Okay, then I continue, I follow your road, and then I will speak in English and to respond to this. As we said, you know, it's very important for any international organization, whether it's a United Nations or Arab League or OIC, the Islamic the organization, is at the heart of it is dialogue, as you always ask in the previous speeches that we hear today. Dialogue is the heart. Sometimes you speak with your quote-unquote your enemies, your friend, and then you know each other. But when you have a dispute in any issue, whether it's in terrorism or border disputes or then dialogue, it's in a civic way to resolve problems. And of course, in our charter, in OIC charter, that there is so many articles that calls for respect for neighborhood and that you have to resolve all the standing issue through dialogue. And this is what this symposium is all about dialogue between South and North or between any other nation. This is an ancient mechanism to solve any problem with mediation, with your friends, with your spouse, with your, in any group. So mediation that's based on a principle of mutual respect is, and a mutual interest, of course, is the way out for any kind of dispute. But if the parties just standing aside, they don't talk to each other, they don't speak to each other, I don't see any way to solve these problems. So I think the secret word is dialogue, dialogue, dialogue.
Minister, in your presentation, you insisted on the victory, and you insisted also on the need for reconstruction and the need for being supported by the international community in doing so. You have referred to the Marshall Plan, for instance. I think that this historical example is telling and very interesting, because the Marshall Plan was made possible because there was a deep political reconstruction of Germany. So if we think in this direction, what would be, according to you, the main step for a political reconstruction of Iraq?
الحقيقة قبل مشروع مارشال صمم.
Well, the UN launched the Truman concept. Truman was president and Marshall was Foreign Affairs Minister. The Marshall Project was sort of the executive branch which implemented it under Marshall. And we saw what happened in the Middle East and in particular in Iraq. We saw soldiers coming from various parts of the world, 124 different nationalities, Daesh in the Mosul. Well, 124 nationalities from all democracies in the world, the US, the UK, Europe, France, Middle East, the Gulf, all over the world. All countries contributed. Iraq was confronting an army made up of all these countries. So support for Iraq is important. The state alone cannot reconstruct entire cities. They, of course, will need support. We've received information, data, training for the armed forces. Now they must help Iraq to reconstruct. This is a legitimate right for a country that is waging a world war. Iraq has fought against soldiers coming from different countries, and this brought into play different religions, different origins, and they won. I think the world should support Iraq, and we should move on. Security aid should turn into economic aid. It's a legitimate right. The world owes it to us. Iraq is a rich country, but it's witnessing an extraordinary stage at the moment. We have water resources, we have oil, we have pilgrimage areas. But after the war, we are experimenting or living through this period. Oh, and then the price of oil went down. And when that price goes down, it creates problems. They're not Iraqi problems. They're problems that come from outside Iraq. We've done what we could. We've asked the countries to support Iraq politically within the UN. We've done all we can. We've asked for economic aid. Various initiatives have been launched, $2.1 billion by way of aid. And in the Kuwait, there'll be an international conference on support to Iraq. And there are opportunities for investment. The door is open, and these countries can benefit from investing in Iraq, and at the same time they would participate in reconstructing Iraq, because the economy is linked to security. All economic regimes in the world are based on the economy, but also on security. Europe would not have been able to get out of its European wars and move towards the European Union without setting up NATO for security. And now, thanks to that, we've achieved the European Union. So again, we've got to work on both sides, security and the economy here too.
Thank you. Robert, maybe the final question. I think that it's a question very often addressed to you, given the current circumstances in the US. What could we expect from the Trump administration? And what sort of piece of advice, if you were in position, would you deliver to President Trump?
So I think there's going to be a panel on U.S. policy, and I have to figure out what I'll say between now and then on Saturday. I'm not in the business of giving advice to President Trump. I do think it is both, very quickly, I think there's a lot of continuity, but there's also a lot of unpredictability with this administration. The main focus seems to be on confronting Iran in the Middle East. That seems to be the major difference from its predecessor. And I have some thoughts on that, which I could share now or on Saturday. I do want to first say to my good friend Ahmed, if the short-term future stability of the Middle East depends on resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I'm afraid the news is much worse than I thought. Because again, I just don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. I do want to say, coming back to the question of what the policy should be, whether it's the U.S. or anyone else, I'm no longer an official, so I could be blunter maybe than others. The subtext of what some have been saying is that until and unless Iran is pushed back from areas in the Arab world where it has interfered, there's no real purpose in engaging with them, because they are interfering in a region where they have no right to be. I'm not going to take a position about who has the right to be where, but that seems to me to be a slightly self-defeating pose. Iran is present. And by the way, the greater the instability and chaos in the region, the more Iran is present. Iran has gained influence in Iraq after the American occupation. It has gained influence in Yemen after the war between Saleh and the Houthis on the one side, and Hadi and the coalition on the other. It's gained influence in Syria as the war has intensified. It's gained influence in Lebanon as Hezbollah and Iran and Israel have been at war. So the notion that one needs to first confront Iran and change the balance of power and then you would engage with them, I think history shows that if anything, that's a counterproductive policy that's going to help those who propose it or say they want to weaken. Which is why I think not just because it's the better outcome in terms of conflict resolution, but also in terms of changing that balance of power in the region, which Ahmed spoke about. I think the solution is to resolve the conflicts in the region, to limit the chaos, limit the instability, limit the ways in which these militias appear because there's conflict. I mean, in each case that I speak of, again, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Syria, these parallel military forces emerge as a result of the chaos and the conflict that exists. So the better approach would be to try to de-escalate through diplomacy. That's the better approach, again, both for humanitarian reasons, for political reasons, but also if the goal is to try to reestablish a certain better sense of balance in the region.
Thank you very much. Apparently, Secretary General would like to start the debate,
If I may, just as a brief comment. Rob, you and I have been working on the Middle East question, seeking a settlement for almost 2 decades or even more. And all that period, for 20, 30 years, we have been telling you, the Egyptians, I was foreign minister of Egypt once, and we have been telling you all along, please, it will explode. The situation will explode. Seek a settlement in order to diffuse the tension between the Arabs, within the Arabs themselves. And every time your administrations were sort of on the brink of putting something, they withdrew or they walked away. So that is the problem. Everything bad we see today emanates directly from 70 years of anger of Egyptian, Arab, Saudi, Khaliji, Emirati. Everybody is angry. Why is he angry? Because people feel the injustice that has been inflicted on the Palestinians all along for 70 years. Yesterday, only yesterday, it was the 29th of November, the marking of the GA resolution 181, 70 plus years ago, dividing Palestine between 2 states, an Israeli and a Palestinian. The Israeli emerged. The Palestinian is still a refugee, sadly.
Just 30 seconds.
It's a good starter for discussion on Saturday morning. But if you want just
30 seconds
briefly. Yeah.
You know, I agree with you, and I have never spared the U.S. of criticism for the way it's dealt with this problem, and I've been very public about it. I do think you had with Secretary Kerry somebody who was absolutely determined to try to reach a settlement. I'm sure that the U.S. made mistakes. Again, I'm never one to hide from that fact. I do think that was a phase during which some of the partners in the Arab world, unfortunately, may not have done everything that they could have done to assist him in what he wanted to achieve, but that's a longer discussion that we could have, I'm sure, separately.
Okay, thank you very much. We'd like to thank all the panelists for their presentation and for this debate.
Thank you very much.
No, please remain seated here. So now it's time to welcome Italian Minister of Defense, Mrs. Roberta PINOTTI. Thank you very much. So the floor is yours, Madam.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon to everybody. I listened with great interest to this panel discussion, and I would like to compliment you because this 3rd edition of this conference shows more and more how important at international level it is becoming, this dialogue about the Mediterranean. It's a very precious opportunity to exchange our views. From what we've heard, and many talked about terrorism and the question as to whether the crisis has been overcome. At least this one. Of course, others have been mentioned too, the Palestinian crisis. That's a crisis that's not very recent. Now, thinking of the latest events of this last month, we have lived through terrible events. Just think of the last atrocious attempt in the Sinai, with hundreds of dead, many, very many children. But in the last month alone, I would recall the attack to the mosque in Nigeria, the attacks in Iraq, in New York. So different places, Middle East, Africa, Sub-Sahara, the Western countries, all attacks striking normality. In Paris, it was a Friday evening. In Berlin, it was the Christmas markets. In Barcelona, the Ramblas. In mosques, where people go to pray. That is to say, where people think they can go to live their usual, normal, serene life. We must not forget this, because I agree with those who said this afternoon that if, on the one hand, we must be highly satisfied with the victory mentioned by the Iraqi minister, our victory over Daesh, we must know also that the fact that we have vanquished the Daesh on certain territories does not mean we vanquished terrorism. But 3 years ago, if we had been here to talk about the same things, we would have been facing a different situation. We would have been surprised, strategically surprised, by a group of terrorists becoming dominant as opposed to other terrorist groups better known in the past, but also that is a winning structure as opposed to formal structures that may have been fragile, but that we did not think were so fragile as to be vanquished by non-statutory bodies or groups. So we were surprised, and we were unprepared, and we must not do this again. But after this moment of surprise, because we didn't expect this progression, because they seemed to be quite it seemed impossible to beat them. They were getting stronger and stronger at one point, and we were really very concerned. But from the summer of 2014, as the Iraqi minister was talking about, September 2014, we see an enormous international coalition being formed. I think, as far as I remember, well, the biggest since I've been dealing with defense, that has the aim of stopping, halting this terrorism. Italy takes part immediately, right from the first meeting. And Italy does so with great determination. The foreign minister said this. We are still in Iraq after the U.S. We are the #2 country from the point of view of presence in the country. And this was a choice that Italy made, a choice. We identified that phenomenon as being a danger, a very serious danger for the territory in which it was spreading, but dangerous for all of us, including Italy, the whole world. So, over the years in Iraq, and I congratulate the bravery with which the Iraqi forces have fought in Syria, in Libya, where at one point things seemed to be developing badly. But we, the caliphate, can no longer proclaim itself as such. But what lessons should we learn from these 3 years? First of all, one first indication is that the international community, in a moment of danger, was able to act together. And the panel discussion, it would be interesting that this cohesion, not military, but diplomatic, exist to settle all the other crises you've been mentioning. Secondly, second indication or lesson is that we cannot replace local authorities to combat terrorism. We cannot underestimate the military, but we cannot replace the local authorities. In this case, a choice of collaborating with the local authorities was right, but they also chose to decide that it must be the military forces of those countries to free themselves for peace to be lasting and for the people to feel that they had freed themselves, which is important. It was not what had been done in the past, and that was a mistake. So this is a second lesson we should have learned. Of course, terrorism has global characteristics, but then it is rooted in specific places, and that is where you have to work with the local authorities and the local reality. This approach we, Italy, have always adopted. In Afghanistan, for example, we're in very close cooperation and links with the local authorities. In the Lebanon, where we have a large mission, and I'm pleased that this conference was opened by the Lebanese president. We have had very close links with the Israeli authorities and all those that could help us carry out our duty, which is to avoid a further moment of tension in the area. We continue to have very close links with the Balkan authorities in the Kosovo, and we've seen how the development of these countries lately has brought them to be more and more active participants of the international community. Some countries have become members of the Atlantic Alliance, others will soon. We do this in Libya. In the delicate and fragile situation that Libya is living, we are there too. We have a humanitarian mission. We have a hospital that has treated those who fought terrorism. We have a mission there that supports not only the training of the Coast Guards, but also reconstruction of the naval forces, which are necessary for Libya. So our experience is that this lesson, that coalition that we, and the fact of working together with the local authorities means that people feel that we are supporting them but not replacing them. And to combat terrorism, I think this is the correct way to go about it. But as you were saying, we cannot think or believe that our job has finished. A continuous dialogue with local authorities must go into how the most difficult battle can be won now, because a military battle where you know there is an occupied territory that you have to reconquer with clear borders, etc. But to understand how to vanquish propaganda, the idea of division and hatred that stems from terrorism, means new tools, new instruments that must be used. The work that's being done to identify and block the sources of financing are important, but the message that must come across is, and we must do this all together, is that it has nothing to do with Islam, with religion, or the hatred and terrorist attacks. We have to eliminate the fascination that some acts have over the young people in those countries, but also in European countries. So this is the more complicated objective that we must not abandon, along with the other one, as the Iraqi minister was saying. And the same goes whether we're talking about Iraq or African countries that want to get out of instability and acquire more stability, but we must also act on development. Okay, the Marshall Plan was mentioned. The Iraqi minister mentioned it for Iraq, but we could talk about it for Africa too. Without a big, broad plan that includes culture, education, that recreates life where it has been destroyed, without that, we will never eliminate completely those situations that help terrorism to develop. Now, how did we manage to work all together with determination over these years in the coalition that then gave support to those who militarily fought against Daesh? Well, all those instruments that we used must be used to continue the battle against terrorism, to stop these attacks, but also at the same time construct development, jobs, and a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can now let the floor.